Hi, I'm Dirk Kim. I'm here with Our Task and News for Our Future. Today with us we have Lester Brown, a noted activist, author, and president of the Earth Policy Institute. What sparked your interest in global sustainability?
My roots are in agriculture, and they go way back. In the early 50s, throughout most of the 50s, my younger brother and I were farming in New Jersey. 1956, I spent the last half of the year living in villages in India, and then in 1959 joined the Foreign Agricultural Service, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, working on a lot of countries around the world, and began to see the problems with deforestation, soil erosion, not just losing topsoil, but the silting of irrigation dams and hydroelectric dams as a result of deforestation and soil erosion. So at a very basic level, began to recognize the unsustainability of some of those trends. And then from there, it's just a matter of building out the much fuller set of environmental trends that we worry about today. The trends that are undermining our future, like climate change, falling water tables, deforestation, soil erosion, collapsing fisheries, deteriorating grasslands that are turning into deserts, and so forth.
What are your thoughts on the rising population growth, especially in developing countries, and the subsequent strain on natural resources?
We've seen enormous growth in world population over the last half century or so. When I lived in Indian villages in 1956, there were 385 million people in India. I thought it was crowded then. Now there are 1.1 billion people in India. We're adding 80 million people a year, which means that every night there'll be 216,000 people at the dinner table who were not here last night. And tomorrow night there'll be another 216,000 more. And after a point, this begins to put a lot of pressure on the Earth's land and water resources. We're in a situation today where population growth, particularly in developing countries, is simply overrunning the resource base. The top 20 failing states, 16 of them have rapid rates of population growth. So it's closely associated now with the political deterioration of countries to the point where they're not countries anymore. Somalia, for example, is a place on the map. You can see it on the eastern coast of Africa, but it's not a functioning country in any meaningful sense. You can't send an ambassador there to present his credentials and report to the government because there really isn't any. And there's more or less chaos in Somalia today. Indeed, that chaos is extended out into the Gulf of Suez, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, as the Somali pirates work to earn a living by taking ships hostage. It's been extraordinarily disruptive in everything. All the goods transported through that sort of major intersection in the world. It's where the oil comes out. It's where the traffic goes through the Suez Canal to avoid going all the way around the Cape of South Africa. So population is a real challenge now, and it's affecting a lot of people in various ways. And my own sense is that we ought to try to bring population growth to a halt by the time we get to 8 billion. We're projected to hit 7 billion in a few months. And the keys to getting the brakes on population growth are, one, a very simple one, filling the family planning gap. The UN Fund for Population Activities estimates that there are today 215 million women in the world who want to plan their families but don't have access to family planning services. Those 215 million women and their families represent over 1 billion people. And that billion people is roughly the billion people poorest billion people in the world. So we have we can fill that family planning gap The estimates are it'll cost about $17 billion a year. Now that sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but it's trivial compared with the benefits. Because one of the keys to moving people out of poverty is to accelerate the shift to smaller families. And likewise, as we eradicate poverty, families become smaller, and as families become smaller, people move out of poverty. So these two trends are reinforcing, stabilizing population and eradicating poverty.
What are some short-term and long-term goals that you have for your foundation?
Our goals are really embodied in what we call Plan B. Plan B is the alternative to business as usual. Business as usual is no longer a viable option. And most people who track world trends, environmental as well as economic and demographic, realize that we can't stay with business as usual much longer. So Plan B is what we think needs to be done if civilization is to be sustained. We environmentalists have been talking for a long time about saving the planet. But as I think about it, the planet's probably going to be around for some time. The question is, will civilization as we know it be around for some time? So with this in mind, we have four major goals in Plan B. One is to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020, not by 2050, which is what political leaders like to talk about. The reason they like that so much is they know they won't be in office when we get to 2050, so they won't be held responsible. But if we want to have a decent shot at saving, say, the Greenland ice sheet, I think we're going to have to cut carbon emissions fast. And that's how we've come up with the goal of cutting 80% by 2020. And we didn't ask the questions, will this be politically popular? We asked the question based on the science of global warming, how much and how fast we have to cut carbon emissions if we want to save the Greenland ice sheet, which is, in a sense, a metaphor for civilization, because if we can't save the Greenland ice sheet, we'll face a 23-foot rise in sea level. And that would displace so many people. I mean, think of the hundreds of coastal cities around the world that would be underwater if the Greenland ice sheet were to melt entirely. Think of the hundreds of millions of climate refugees, of rising sea refugees. Think of the United States with two real estate markets, one in coastal areas where prices are dropping, one in the rest of the country where prices are rising, for example. I mean, it would be chaotic. The second one is, we think it's time to eradicate poverty. And when you look at what it takes, and as Jeffrey Sachs, the economist now at Columbia, who heads the Earth Institute there, says, for the first time in history, we have the resources to eradicate poverty. We can do it if we decide we want to. And the third thing is getting the brakes on population growth so we don't go beyond 8 billion. And fourth is restoring the economy's natural support systems. Forests, this means reforestation, soils, soil conservation, better land management, better fishery management, setting up marine parks so fish populations can recover. Water is emerging as a major constraint around the world on food production. And so we think we have to restore the economy's natural support systems. No civilization before us has survived the ongoing destruction of its natural support systems.
You brought up economics, and in your book you mentioned that we needed a change of perspective on what is national security. Could you explain that a little bit more?
We define national security almost exclusively in military terms. But this is a definition we've inherited from the last century, a century that was dominated by 2 world wars and a Cold War. What we need today is a definition of security not for the 20th century, but for the 21st century. And if I sit down with a pad of paper, blank pad, and ask myself, what are the principal threats to our security today. Climate change, water shortages, rising food prices, growing political instability, failing states. Armed aggression doesn't even make the top 5 on my list. It might make the top 10. And I'm not talking about just an intellectual redefining of security, but redefining security in fiscal terms. So we spend less for military purposes and more on things like stabilizing population, eradicating poverty, reforestation, raising water productivity, et cetera, et cetera. This is where our future is going to be decided. This is where the battle is going to be won or lost, not in who has the most advanced weapon systems in the world. The other thing that's interesting now is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to talk about national security, because without global security, there is no national security. If the Earth's climate system is spiraling out of control, we're all affected by it. We're all in this together. And the weak link in the system is probably going to be food, just as it was for so many of the earlier civilizations whose archaeological sites we now study.
You've set some very high goals for the global community by 2020, such as the cutting of carbon emissions by 80%. How do you envision the different communities and cultures of the world coming together in order to solve this problem?
Well, it's probably not going to come through internationally negotiated climate agreements, that's for sure. I think what's going to happen is that individual countries are going to begin to move ahead on their own. I mean, interesting, there are 2 small countries, Costa Rica and the Maldive Islands off the coast of India, which have now accepted zero carbon emissions as a goal for 2020. And they may well both reach it. We haven't seen any major industrial country do this yet, but what we did see a few weeks ago was Prime Minister David Cameron of the UK saying that the UK was adopting a goal of cutting carbon emissions 50% by 2025. Now, 50% is not 80%, but it's a huge step in the right direction, and it's much further than any other industrial country has been willing to go. But one of the things that may happen is that we may get scared on the climate front. And we'll be scared perhaps by the climate events themselves, whether it's wildfires or floods or droughts or tornadoes or hurricanes or more extreme weather events of every kind. But the thing that may bring this home for us could be rising food prices. The one thing we all have in common is we eat. And food prices affect how much and what we eat. So that could become the issue that will be the wake-up call that will bring us together, sort of the Pearl Harbor, if you will.
In your book, you mention the Pearl Harbor situation as well as a couple of other situations that you use as a metaphor. Could you explain those a little bit?
In thinking about social change, I sort of use 3 different models. One I call the Pearl Harbor model, where a catastrophic event changes everything, literally overnight. Another I call the Berlin Wall model, and that's where you have gradually rising pressure for change of some sort until it reaches a tipping point and, in effect, overthrows the political system. The Berlin Wall coming down was the visual manifestation of a political revolution in Eastern Europe that changed the form of government in every country in the region, essentially without bloodshed, Romania being the minor exception. We may be on the edge of a very difficult food situation because last year we saw a huge drawdown in grain stocks because of the extreme heat and drought in Western Russia. The assumption was that with very good prices, encouraging farmers to go all out this spring in planting and so forth, that this year we'd catch up and rebuild stocks. In fact, it doesn't look like there's going to be any rebuilding this year. We may even draw stocks down somewhat more. That means that there's no potential relief in sight until next year's harvest, the fall of next year, at best. So food may become the wake-up call here as we begin to realize that even when we're scrambling, we can't keep up. And that's kind of a, leaves you with a bad feeling. I mean, it's a matter of concern. And the third model, social change, I call the sandwich model, where you have an upwelling of support for change coming from the grassroots and the political leadership that's responsive to that change. I think we have that to some degree now in this country on the climate issue, but not nearly, the sandwich is not nearly as strong as we might have hoped it would be.
Can you share your thoughts on the viability of alternative energies as a means to fulfill our global energy need?
Well, one of the exciting developments in recent years has been the realization of how much renewable energy we have. I remember when the Algerians were first beginning to work on building solar thermal power plants. And they pointed out that in their desert, which is most of Algeria, they had enough harnessable solar energy to power the world economy. That sounded like someone made a mistake in the calculations, but they didn't. I mean, this basic point appears in the energy literature when it's noted that the sunlight striking the Earth in 1 hour contains enough energy to run the world economy for 1 year. With wind power, things are just off the top of the chart. There was a joint US-China team of scientists that did an inventory of potential wind energy in China. And what they pointed out, and this is published in an article in Science, I guess close to 2 years ago now, is that China has enough harnessable wind energy to increase its current electricity consumption 16-fold. This is not, almost enough or just about enough. It's 16 times what they're currently consuming from wind alone. We've known for a long time in this country that we have 3 states, North Dakota, Kansas, and Texas, that have enough harnessable wind energy, not only to satisfy national electricity needs, but national energy needs to run the entire economy on wind alone. And the exciting thing about wind farms is you can bring them online so fast. The typical wind farm built in this country, 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, 300 megawatts, is built within a year. From the time they break ground on the construction site until they're gone and the electricity is flowing into the local grid is usually less than 12 months. So we know that wind and solar are just extraordinarily abundant. So is geothermal. I mean, looking at Japan, for example, I've been preaching geothermal in Japan for years. Any country that has 10,000 hot baths, natural hot baths, with hot water very near the surface, has a lot of geothermal energy and a lot of accessible geothermal energy. Japan could back out all of its nuclear power plants just by harnessing geothermal energy. It's a very geothermally rich country, and they're finally beginning to think about it now. They should have been thinking about it a long time ago. So in my mind, the constraints on the role that renewable energy can play lie not in the resources, but in our perceptions of what's possible and what's not. Today, we have a lot of automobile plants in the world that represent excess capacity. We now know we've overbuilt by, 20 or 30% probably. We're producing this year probably 65 million cars we could produce maybe 90 million cars if we wanted to. Why not take those assembly lines and use them to produce wind turbines? Not in the thousands or hundreds of thousands, but in the millions. 5 million large wind turbines would supply most of the world's electricity. 10 million would probably supply all of it. It's entirely doable if we decide we want to do it. And the other thing with wind, of course, is what people say, the wind blows sometimes and not at other times. That's true. But what is also true is that if you build a large grid, then as a model developed for U.S. wind resources by a team at Stanford University points out, if we had a national grid and wind farms all over the place, wind could become baseload, because wind's always blowing in some parts of the country, and so the fluctuations are no longer an issue.
What do you think is the best method for everyday people to lessen their impact on the global community?
I'm often asked the question as I travel around the world, what can I do? And people expect me to say, well, replace your light bulbs and recycle your newspapers and so forth. Those things are important, but that's not what I tell them to do. I tell them to become politically active. Pick one of the issues that's important to them. Closing coal-fired power plants. Find some friends who share your concern. Begin to organize. Become politically active. And if you're interested